It was great information. Next, we have Christian Reece with Club 20. I'm going to say via satellite. I always want to say that, right? That goes back to my old media days. But thank you for joining us from Grand Junction. A lot going on at the state level.
I'm so glad to be here with you guys. Let me just share my screen. It is very, very hot in Grand Junction. I'm not sure if it's that hot down there in Durango, but I think we're supposed to get up to 96. So hopefully it's cooler down there for you all. I am Christian Reece. I'm the Executive Director of Club 20, and I am extremely honored to be able to be here with you today. So some of you have never heard of Club 20, which is a shame. So I want to take just a second to help everybody understand who and what Club 20 actually is. So Club 20 is a nonpartisan, nonprofit coalition of businesses, of individuals, and communities who come together to amplify the voice of Western Colorado. We know that in the more rural parts of the state, like Western Colorado, we are outnumbered when it comes to legislative issues. And so for 67 years, Club 20 has been amplifying the voice to try to make sure that we have just as much influence at the state capitol and at the federal level as some of our more urban counterparts. I wanted to give a bit of an overview of what's been happening with the state legislature, some of the bills and ballot measures that we're keeping a close eye on, and just kind of frame up with what we've been working on. So the state legislature adjourned on March 14th, and it resumed on May 26th last week. The Speaker of the House has directed legislators to bring forward only bills that are bipartisan, that have no fiscal note, and are related to COVID. So a lot of bills are getting killed right now, and unfortunately, the state is facing an approximately $3.3 billion budget shortfall for fiscal year 2020 to 21. So some of the cuts that are being considered and that are moving through the process include any new programs that were established last year and last legislative session that had a fiscal note. Many of those programs are looking at being cut. PARA had a balloon payment scheduled that will be likely suspended. There's a lot of conversation around suspending the senior homestead exemption, which, you know, certainly that benefits our seniors, so that's a bit concerning. Colorado Department of Transportation's general fund payment has been canceled, or is going to be canceled. Full day kindergarten is up on the chopping block as well, the funding for that. K-12 grant programs are unfortunately going to be cut. And then all state capital construction appropriations are likely to be eliminated. So a lot of really important activities that were funded last year, but unfortunately are going to be getting their funding cut this year to try to make up for that $3 billion deficit. As I mentioned, at the legislature right now, they are working through the process of killing a lot of the existing legislation that had already been introduced before they went into recess for COVID, but they are also introducing new legislation to deal with the federal funds that the state has received, some of the impacts and regulatory easing that are being, the ideas that are being put forward to try to ensure that Colorado recovers from this mini recession that we're in right now with COVID. So I'm just going to talk about a couple measures that Club 20 has identified as some of the key issues being considered that have the potential to have the greatest impacts to Western Colorado. So the first one that I want to talk to you all about is a repeal of the Gallagher Amendment. So if you don't know what the Gallagher Amendment is, there's a great nonpartisan website called Building a Better Colorado, and they have about a 20-minute video that does a very good job of breaking down what Gallagher is if you don't understand quite what it is. But this measure, it's SCR, so that's a concurrent resolution, 20001, would refer a measure to voters to repeal the residential assessment rate and the non-residential assessment rate in the Constitution of Colorado. So currently those two rates are set in the Colorado Constitution. This repeal would remove them from the Constitution. The concurrent resolution would require a supermajority to pass a legislature, and if it does pass a legislature, would then be on the 2020 November ballot. There is potential that there would be a separate bill to freeze the residential assessment rate at 7.15%, which is what it is currently, and the business rate at 29% for 4 years. That would be a separate piece of legislation that has yet to be introduced. And the reason why that would be a separate piece of legislation is that just the removal of the residential assessment rate and the non-residential rate from the Constitution doesn't freeze those rates necessarily. It will remove them from Constitution and put them in statute, in which case the state legislature can adjust down. They can adjust up without going to a vote of the people because of Tabor, but they could adjust those in future legislatures. So the idea to try to freeze those rates is kind of a compromise bill to say, let's just freeze the rates where they're at for 4 years and then we can reassess. And so that, again, that hasn't been introduced, that portion hasn't been introduced just yet, but I think it's on its way. So Club 20 is supportive of repealing the Gallagher Amendment. We do have some of our partners who do have some concerns regarding the potential for reduced revenues for local governments. And what that would look like is if the legislature in future sessions did decide to reduce the non-residential rate, that would mean a reduction in revenue for our local government partners. And that certainly could happen if this separate bill is not introduced to freeze the rates. So I'm sure there'll be some questions on that, and it's an extremely complex and convoluted issue. So I'm glad to help provide clarity at that when we go into Q&A. Another bill that we are actively engaging on is a proposal to try to save the reinsurance program. So as many of you may know, reinsurance was a piece of legislation that was passed last session, I believe, maybe the session before, 2 years ago, maybe. Essentially what it does is it removes the high-risk individuals from the individual marketplace and kind of puts them in a separate insurance pool, and resulted in a statewide average of 19% reduction in individual market health insurance premiums. Some portions of Western Colorado actually saw up to a 30% reduction in health insurance premiums in the individual market. So for some of those extremely high cost areas, particularly in our resort communities, this had a huge impact, a huge beneficial impact on their individual premiums. The funding for reinsurance is set to expire in 2021. And so this proposal identifies a new funding mechanism to fund reinsurance. So it funds it differently than it was previously funded, but it funds it through a fee, a tax on insurance carriers, and then also a $20 million fee assessed to hospitals. The bill was just introduced yesterday. There are certainly some areas that Club 20 has of concern, but we've actively reached out to the bill sponsors to try to work through some of those concerns to make sure that we're able to save the reinsurance program. Another bill that we're looking at is the worker compensation insurance for COVID. So that what this bill would do is it would allow a employee to file for workers' compensation if they contracted COVID or some other occupational disease. And that bill, if you guys want to look it up, is Senate Bill 2216. And then another bill we're keeping an eye on is the COVID whistleblower protection, which is still in draft form, but what it would do is it would allow an employee, if their employer wasn't taking proper precautions as identified by the state health department to prevent and protect employees from contracting COVID, this would protect whistleblowers from any, malaction for reporting their employer for not being in line with the state recommendations. And one of the last ones I wanted to talk about real quick, I know I'm running out of time, is modifications to the Rural Jumpstart Zone. So Rural Jumpstart program, the short version is it allows institutions of higher education to work with the business community to provide some tax incentives and that sort of thing to spur some economic development. This was on the chopping block at the beginning of COVID, and I think that we were able to get this saved, and it's now a priority issue for the governor, so we're excited about that. I'll skip this slide, but we all know there's been some pretty significant impacts due to COVID, and Club 20 is actively working to try to ameliorate some of those impacts so that they are not as strongly felt. And then last, I wanted to just talk about some of the ballot measures that we're keeping an eye on. 3 have already been certified to be on the ballot. That's national popular vote, citizen qualification of electors, and restoration of gray wolves. So those, you can read the text of these 3 bills on the Secretary of State's website. There's 14 measures approved for circulation. The 2 that are actively gathering signatures right now are the Paid Family Medical Leave Insurance Program and the Graduated Income Tax proposal, which would make changes to state income tax. There are quite a few that are pending that are in the process, but in many cases aren't collecting signatures just yet. The state of Colorado is looking at, has actually promulgated rules around virtual electronic signature gathering. There is a coalition who has litigated against the state for this directive because for areas in rural parts of the state that don't have access to high-speed internet, it is felt that they have a disparate ability to sign petitions. And there's also great concern about the ability for fraud. So there is a pending lawsuit against the state that's going to the Supreme Court for this measure. And then there's also an effort to try to keep Western Colorado in one congressional district when it comes to the redistricting process that will happen as a result of the 2020 census. So those are just a few things that I wanted to get on your radar. Club 20 does have some events coming up, one relatively close to Durango. July 9 and 10 will be in your Ray with these Club 20 policy committees, and then up in Craig, July 23rd and 24th. And as of right now, we are still planning to move forward with our fall conference and candidate debates, and hope everybody will join us for those, assuming that it's safe to do so. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and I sure appreciate being here with you today.
Kristen, thank you. A lot of great information, and I invite everybody to continue to check out the information through Club 20 and get on your email list, because you sent out some wonderful updates from the legislatures and with everything happening with COVID. Thank you for all the great work you're doing. Next on our presentation